Good evening. My name is Chase Robinson, and as president, I have the privilege of welcoming you to the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. What is the relationship between globalization and income inequality? That's the question that Branko Milanovic poses in his newest book, Global Inequality: A New Approach for the Age of Globalization. In it, Branko highlights an intriguing paradox. Even as inequality has soared within many countries, it's fallen dramatically at the global level. Specifically, he writes about who has been helped the most by globalization, who's been held back, and what policies might tilt the balance towards economic justice. His is a departure from the traditional approach of examining inequality exclusively within countries. And based on the reviews the book has received over the last few weeks, it is something of a sensation. The Financial Times calls it informative, wide-ranging, scholarly, and imaginative, adding significantly to important recent works by Thomas Piketty, Anthony Atkinson, and François Bourguignon. The Economist, another example, said that Milanovic's theorizing chips away at tired economic orthodoxies. How fortunate, then, are we not just to feature one of the most prominent thinkers on the topic of inequality, our author, but three, all of whom are based here at the Graduate Center. Now, this intellectual capital speaks volumes not just about the Graduate Center, but about also the City University of New York, which is itself an extraordinary project in reducing inequality and increasing opportunity. Of the university's about 260,000 undergraduates, 42% are the first in their families to attend college. A full 40% of CUNY's undergraduates come from households with annual incomes below $20,000. The Graduate Center, which focuses on doctoral education and advanced teaching and research, is a crucial part of that project. Every year, our 3,800 doctoral students reach about 200,000 CUNY undergraduates in classrooms and labs. Our students are remarkable not just for the contribution they make to undergraduate education, but also for their own research. Last year, one of our students won a Guggenheim, and one of our students won a Pulitzer Prize. This institution, I'm very proud to say, is becoming the leading center for empirical research on socioeconomic inequalities. We can boast top researchers and experts, the satellite office of the world's most important income database and resource, the Luxembourg Income Study Center, or LIS, a rapidly growing cohort of PhD students using the data, and a multitude of collaborations. For that reason and many others, we could not be more delighted than to host tonight's conversation and to showcase our three scholars. First, Branko Milanovic is visiting presidential professor at the Graduate Center, as well as senior scholar at the LIS Center. Previously, he served as lead economist in the World Bank's Development Research Group. During his long career, Branko has focused his research on income distribution, a dynamic field to say the least. He likes to say that 4 years after he defended his dissertation on income inequality in the former socialist Yugoslavia, the country disappeared. He's also the author of The Haves and Have-Nots, a brief and idiosyncratic history of global inequality, and numerous articles. Branko is joined on the stage by Paul Krugman, the Nobel laureate, the New York Times columnist and author, distinguished scholar here again at the LIS Center, and distinguished professor in our Department of Economics. He's been called the most important political economist in America by Washington Monthly, and the most celebrated economist of his generation by The Economist. He's also, as you will know, the author of numerous best-selling books. Janet Gornick is professor of political science and sociology and director of the List Center. For over 30 years, Janet has been a leading researcher and educator in the field of American social welfare policy, especially as it affects the economic status of women and families. Her book, Families That Work, has been widely used in teaching for over a decade in the US and in Europe. Her most recent book, co-edited with Marcus Yanti, is Income Inequality, Economic Disparities, and the Middle Class in Affluent Countries. Now here I can't resist noting in closing that while Paul, Janet, and Branko work very, very closely in our List Center, tonight is the first time they actually share the same stage. Please do join me in welcoming our distinguished speakers.
Thank you, Chase. Am I on here? Does that sound good? Thank you, Chase. Let me step in and just tell you a little bit about the logistics for the evening. First of all, I'm wearing multiple hats. We're efficient here at the Graduate Center in the face of budget cuts, so I'm moderating, I'm asking questions, and I'm answering questions. So that's what we're going to do, and I'm going to keep time. So this is what we're going to do, just to give you a little bit of a preview. We're going to have this conversation in 3 interlocking chapters. It's a complicated and very rich book that is our starting point. So first, Branko is going to lay out his findings on global inequality, starting with one very lively slide that he'll walk us through. I'm going to pose a few questions to him and to Paul then about the implications of Branko's findings and also about the underlying causal mechanisms embodied in this story that he's going to tell you. And then second, we're going to move to the question of income differences between countries or across countries, which is a big part of the story of global inequality. And again, Branko is going to show you some of his key findings via a single slide, and I'll pose a few questions to them. And then for the third chapter, we're going to turn to the question of within-country inequality with a focus on the US, and there's where I'm going to jump in and provide an overview of income inequality in the US, both today and also over time. And then we'll turn to the question of policy implications with a focus on the United States. So our question is going to be how are we going to make America great again? So that's the plan. So why not, right? So then that'll take us to about 8 o'clock. And then we're going to open up for Q&A, and we're going to welcome questions from the audience. There are mics in the aisle. I'll keep my eye on the time there. And at 8:20, we're going to break, and Branko's going to step out and sign books, and Paul will come down to the audience. I will as well, and we'll chat a little bit. So that's the plan for the evening. So let me invite you, Branko, to go ahead and put up your first slide and walk the audience through it.
Well, okay, thank you very much, Janet. I would, after this somewhat ominous introduction that Chase had about the country disappearing after 40 years, and given that my topic is the world, I hope this is not going to happen twice. So let me start, as Janet said, with a slide that many of you might have seen actually on the internet, and it was tweeted and retweeted quite a few times, actually not least thanks to Paul also sort of using it in one of his columns. Now, the slide, I think, is interesting. I have to explain it a little bit, and you will see when I explain it why I think actually it attracted quite a lot of attention. Now, what you have on the horizontal axis is that you have actually technically all individuals in the world lined up from the poorest, which would be like number 1 on this slide, to the richest people, who will be number 100. So basically that number 100 is actually the global top 1%, the richest people in the world. Now, in order to do that ranking, you have to have household surveys from lots of countries, actually 120 countries in the world, and of course you do it at different time intervals, because as you will see, there is a comparison between 2 points in time. So you have then lined up everybody in the world. I said technically 7 billion people. Of course, they are not there. You actually have household surveys which are representative of the countries. And then on the vertical axis, what the graph shows is what was the increase in income in real terms between 1988 and 2008. So that was the idea of the slide. It does seem simple, as I said, but it actually takes lots of numbers because you have to have all this household service, and thanks to Liz, of course, we cover about half or maybe more of the world now, but the slide covers practically everybody. So now, what you notice there is that actually somewhere around the middle, or actually the median of the world, you have very large increases in real income. So on the vertical axis, if you can read it, it's actually about 80% increase in real income. Now, when you ask and look at these people there, first you ask yourself, who are these people? And second, you should also notice, and that's why I put this number, you notice that actually they are not rich people. They're actually, by US standards, by rich country standards, relatively poor people, because the median income in the world is only about $5 or $6 per day. So it's actually not very much, again, by the rich country standards. But they are what you might call, and I put it under quotes, you can call it China's middle class, although it's not only Chinese middle class, it's really most of the countries in Asia, like China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, and so on. But for simplicity, we can just call it that point A, with large increases in real income, we can call it China's middle class. Then you go further, this slide, and then you reach people who are actually significantly better off than what we call the Chinese middle class, but that's where the income distribution of the rich world really begins, because the rich world really doesn't have too many people who are below that point, which, as you notice, actually is a point of the 80th percentile in the world. So practically anybody in the US, practically, not actually everybody, but like 95% of the people are above that point. So there, what you notice, that peculiarity is that actually there you see almost no growth. So that's my point B, and that's actually a very striking point, because there is this big contrast between the point A, where you have people who are globally in the middle class, but relatively poor compared to the people in the US, and they have actually grown a lot. And then you have people who are quite poor by US standards, and they have not grown at all, almost. And it's not only the US, I call it, for simplicity here, US lower middle class, but it's really the lower part of the distributions of many rich countries. Actually, 72% of people in that group are from OECD countries. And to give you an example, it's also US, Germany, that many people don't know. Germany actually also had a relatively bad period, lower part of the income distribution at least. And then Japan. Okay, and then finally the third point in this slide, which is also quite dramatic, not surprising, is that, of course, at the very top, this global top 1%, you have people who have actually gained quite substantially. You have also an increase of 80%. Just 2 points before I finish this. We have, of course, looked, and we are going to look only here, practically, at relatives, which means how many percentages have you gained over that period. But in reality, of course, what one needs to understand and to realize is that the gains at the top are multiple in terms of absolute numbers. Because if you have somebody who has, as we can see here, $180 per day, then even if he gains, a couple of percentage points, that would be $3, let's suppose. But for people who are actually at $4, that would mean 2/3 of their income or 3/4 of their income. So in other words, the relatives that we are focusing here are very important, but we should not forget that behind them are also absolute gains, which are, of course, much, much stronger on the top. And the final point, of which, of course, we will talk, I think, a lot today, is that contrast between points A and B. The contrast between the rising, let's call it global middle class, that is relatively poor, and the stagnating lower or maybe sort of lower middle or middle class in the rich countries. And that, of course, is one of the reasons that actually many people were attracted to the graph, because it illustrates it in an empirical and quite intuitive way.
Thank you. So let me ask a conceptual question. Paul, I'm going to ask you to chime in first. So just to underscore something, I think most of you know this, and Chase said it as well. The great majority of research on income inequality uses the country as the unit of analysis. That's true of about 90% of the papers using the data from LIS. It's true of the work by Piketty and Atkinson and Saez on the World Top Income Database. So this idea of merging all of these data sets and thinking about a global distribution is quite unusual. Branko is really one of the few who's worked this way. So the question is, why do we care about the global distribution? I would say on the one hand, it makes us think about the human community and not just our national communities. We're also going to talk about interactions across countries in a moment. But on the other hand, there are so few policy levers at the global level. So I guess the question is tracking global inequality an intellectual exercise with little application?
Okay, so am I on? Yeah, I'm on. I would say first off, we certainly want that picture. If you want you want a story about the world, you want to know. So people are always want to ask. Well, it's kind of common knowledge that there's been some convergence of national incomes, that countries like China are on the rise relative to the advanced countries, and on the other hand, that there's rising inequality, and how do I think about that? Is global inequality rising? Is it falling? And to which Branko has given us the answer is yes. It is both rising and falling depending on how you look at it, and this is a really compact, a simple way to understand very clearly what's going on. And if you do have some notion of caring about human welfare, well, there's your story, and it's you can make that. It's not a completely unambiguous story, but it's a story you want to tell. But I think if we are trying to think about, if we think that there is some kind of process that's going on, that this is in fact just one story, which is not entirely clear. I think we'll come back to that. But if we think that there is one story going on here, that is something that presumably can be affected by policies. If we think that globalization is what's driving everything we see here, then globalization, if there's one thing that I think everyone who does international trade is aware and has any sense of history is aware of, it's that globalization is not an irreversible, unstoppable process. There have been ups and downs. The world was much more globally integrated in 1913 than it was in 1953. That if you have protectionism, you have barriers, you can ramp globalization down. I mean, you may think that making America great again by putting immense tariffs on everything from outside America is a good idea or a bad idea, but it's not an infeasible idea. You can certainly make it happen. So then the question is, how do I think about the effects? To the extent that that's what's driving this, it matters a lot. I would actually just add one specific thing. The era that Branko is covering here, which, by the way, was not at all the same. The previous 20 years don't look like this at all. This corresponds roughly to the period of something that in my neck of the woods is typically referred to as hyperglobalization. Up until about 1990, the rise in international trade could be viewed largely as recovery to the kind of global integration we had before World War I. It wasn't dramatically a different kind of thing. But after 1990 or so, something different happened. And we had much more intense international trade. And probably that didn't have to happen. Probably it was stoppable. So the question is, well, what does that do? And here we have this picture to tell us what perhaps it does. And it's very important to understand what's going on.
Janet, one thing that actually I would like to point out is that this kind of a picture where actually you have an increase in gains around the median, well, first they go up from when you're poor, they're actually relatively low, and then they increase all the way to the median, and then suddenly precipitously decline for people who are around the 80th percentile in the world, and then go back again, is very unusual. Actually, you don't have individual countries that often have, or almost ever, that particular shape. Because think what it means if this were translated to an individual country. It would mean that you had really the top group that did extremely well, but then they enacted some policies, let's suppose tax hikes or something, which really screwed people who are just below them, and then the middle class did extremely well. So it's very unusual, because what you typically find, in the US, for example, we'll talk about that a little bit later, you'll find that this graph would go upwards. In other words, the gains would almost monotonically increase as you become richer. So that's a typical pattern for increasing inequality. When you have a decline in inequality, a typical pattern is also that you would have a downward sloping curve. So the unusual part, of course, because it's the world and we have growth rates that are widely different between, this is really that which is driving mostly that graph. And last point about what Paul mentioned before, actually, Paul was the one who actually asked me, he said, do you think you could actually do similar, graph for the period before 1988? Now, that's very difficult because we really didn't have surveys really from most of the countries in the world. Now, however, thanks to actually François Bourguignon and Christian Morisson, you can do something which is not as good as this because the data are not as good. But however, what you get really a flat line, more or less. So you really don't get this very unusual jump, which is not only driven by the way that I organize the graph. You know, the origin of the graph is at 0. So it's really a very unusual sort of pattern that we have here.
So, Paul, would you talk a little bit more about the causality? You started to allude to this, but I think the question would be, essentially, is there a trade-off? Is this growth in the middle causing the dip further up? Is the growth of the global middle class harming the lower middle class in the rich countries, including in the U.S.? That's a story we hear a lot. It has a lot of domestic, power to that. There's a lot of political power in that story.
Yeah, so let me do this, and first let's tell that story, and then I'll give you a little skepticism. But there's a story which says that what's happened is some combination of factors, containerization, which made shipping more easier, better communications, and also policy changes. A lot of the developing countries, which had very inward-looking policies, turned outward-looking instead, causes this surge in global trade. A lot of it low labor-intensive products being exported from developing countries to advanced countries, and what a fairly standard trade analysis would say, well, that's going to actually cause increasing inequality in the rich countries. It's going to drive down wages of workers who don't have exceptional skills, who don't own a lot of capital. But it's also going to lead to a big rise or lead to a rise in the wages of workers in the developing countries. And if that's the story, then there is a trade-off. Unless you are in a position to really do a lot of redistribution in the advanced country, then we are saying, well, we're getting gains for the workers of Bangladesh, but they're coming at the expense of the workers of Michigan. And if that's a very difficult story. It's a morally difficult story because you can say, well, gee, why are our vulnerable people in the United States suffering? We should stop this. But then you say, you've got Bangladesh, which more or less literally keeps its head above water only by being able to sell these low labor-intensive, as somebody said, they're not a banana republic, they're a pajama republic. Exports of apparel are pretty much all that keeps them going. Do you really want to stand in the way of that process? Now, there are some questions. It's a story that, at first sight, it's perfect, right? Standard, because by the way, it's a myth about international trade that standard international trade analysis says trade is good for everybody. It's not what it says. It actually says it can very easily have large effects on income distribution. And so that's by no means true. And this picture seems to fit that story rather well. A couple of problems with it. One is that the numbers, when you try to go through the causation, they just don't look big enough, even now. Even with all this increase in trade, it's hard to tell a story and that's a hard thing to explain. But the numbers don't look big enough to cause all of the increase in inequality we've seen in the advanced world. And they also don't look big enough to explain the incredible growth of these developing countries. Trade is good according to our analysis, but it's not 80% gain in income good. And so we have a really hard time with that. Another thing is this says that really inequality should be rising in the advanced world, but by that story it should be declining in the developing world, which is not by and large what we see. By and large, so we're seeing the Chinese middle class is rising, but there's also a substantial number of Chinese billionaires popping up. And so doesn't seem to be the story. So it kind of looks like at most the globalization is only part of the story. The reasons to be skeptical about the just monocausal globalization is causing all of this. But I think the dilemma is real. The dilemma that says, well, if you care about the advanced country working class, you probably want to be a protectionist, or you might want to be a protectionist, but then what about the workers of the third world?
Branko, let me push you on to the next slide because I think it follows from this point.
It does, but if I may, well, I'm not sure if I'm going to repeat everything that I said because apparently my mic was off. So should I really restart? I will not. So I would just want to just say one more thing. Actually, in my book, I call it, to simplify, of course, what Paul was and you were mentioning, it's a story of globalization behind that graph. Now, there could be also technological change, and there could be also policy. So I kind of simplify it as I called it TOP, because it's technology, openness, and policy. When I was last week in Paris and actually presented the same slide, and Piketty was a discussant, he actually said, well, you're really underplaying the role of policy. So we agreed that actually it should be called POT, because it's policy, openness, and technology, depending what you want really to put as the first emphasis, whether it should be TOP or POT or OPT. But I think three of them are very often like going together as a package. Now, okay, let me then, should I go for the next slide now? I would, well, the next slide is, again, using global income distribution, but it now shows things a little bit differently. So now, if you will focus on the horizontal axis, it is the position in the country percentile. And let me just show what it means. Basically, you ask yourself, I am in the US, like in what percentile do I sort of think I am? It is not really here about your opinions, it's actually about your incomes, but just to give you an idea what the horizontal axis is. And then you look at the vertical axis, and then you have your position in the global income distribution. As I was saying before, when I was actually saying that there are relatively few very few Americans who are poor by global standards. Or if I were to draw here, instead of the US, I could draw, for example, Denmark. And that line for Denmark would start at the 85th percentile in the world. As you can see, for the US, it starts there at the lowest percentile in the US is the 55th percentile in the world. So essentially what it shows you is that actually, obviously, every additional point on the horizontal axis is going to push you higher on the global as well. And essentially, the US is a country where everybody is above the world median. Well, it's also interesting when you look at the very top. So this would be like the lowest American, I mean, obviously there are people with zero income also because you might have actually sudden, you can draw on your savings and survive, but basically it is kind of a lowest income in a statistical sense, like significant sense that exists in the US. And then of course you have here people who are at the very top, and 12% of Americans are in the global top 1%. So we talked like a couple of minutes ago about this global top 1%, and first 12% of all Americans, many of us here are actually obviously in that global top 1%, but 12% of Americans are in that global top 1%, and actually half of the population in that global top percent is American. So rich countries dominate in that global top 1%. And then, of course, the other extreme, although this is a little bit an exaggeration because the Indian data are, this is consumption data, and they actually underestimated the income at the very top. But take this with a grain of salt, but nevertheless, you will not have 12 million Indians, because we're talking about each percentile, and one percentile in India is 12 million people. 12 million people on average will not have an income which will put them in the global top 1%. So you have really this kind of a striking sort of gap between rich countries and poor countries. Now, we always knew that, but what is actually interesting, I think, here is that you can see that gap not only like mean in the US versus mean in India, you can actually see that gap across the entire distribution. And then you can bring other countries. I've actually taken several large countries here. This one is China. Of course, that was done in 2008. Already I have like 2011. China is already higher. So basically that Chinese line would essentially increase throughout. So it would actually even come to the top 1%. And you notice already sort of a middle class, global middle class. You notice another thing actually, that the Chinese median is about the same as the global median, which is sort of interesting. Then I have here, the next country is Russia, with actually, with obviously significant middle class. And if I were to break China into two, rural and urban, Chinese urban would be slightly ahead of the Russian average. So that's where Chinese urban is. And of course, Chinese rural is much below Chinese mean. So, and finally, this is a country that I would let you guess at first, which it is, if it doesn't show, it showed too fast. This was Brazil, and I could have taken Brazil or South Africa, because that country really spans the world. So as you can see, it has really people who are among the poorest in the world, like bottom 1%. It has significant middle class. It has people who are the 80th, 90th percentile in the world, and it has people who are at the top. So in other words, it almost mimics the world, and South Africa comes fairly close to mimicking the world in terms of income distribution, or Brazil for that matter.
So let's talk about the implications of this picture. I think one thing that is clear so far is that there are enormous differences in income levels across countries, obviously, and that's a big component of global inequality. That suggests in a very stylized way, two possible ways to decrease global inequality. One is to spur economic growth in the poorer countries, a catch-up model, and another would be widespread migration of people from poorer countries to richer countries. Paul, how do you react to that? Is that realistic? Is it reasonable? What's the approach, given these kinds of income differentials, to thinking about reducing global inequality?
Okay, so let's do three solutions that you've offered. One is faster growth in poor countries, which in fact, the interesting is that we've been achieving that. That's the great success. So whatever else you may say about this period since the hyperglobalization began and whatever the causes, the fact of the matter is, from that point of view, it's been a golden age. Actually, when I went to grad school, which in the mid-'70s, I tried to think, what should I focus on? And I thought, well, development economics, that's really important. And decided not to because it was too depressing. Because in the 1970s, there wasn't. Development economics was basically non-development economics. Nobody succeeded in catching up at all, and that totally changed. And so that's a very good thing. And so on point one, we're actually doing pretty well. Point two, well, that's where, that's a lot of our politics. We're trying to reduce inequality within countries, which, we're not politically, we haven't gotten our act together to do that at all here, but some developing countries actually have. So one of the interesting stories, although kind of falling apart right now, is Latin American efforts to reduce inequality. And we'll be talking about what we might be doing there. Now, migration is really interesting, right? I guess in some cosmic sense, I have to be for, because otherwise I wouldn't be here, you wouldn't be here, Branko, we're all of us CUNY babies whose fathers went to some part of the CUNY system did so because somewhere down the line ancestors came to America. Migration is an enormous force for upward mobility and narrowing of income gaps as poor people come from poor countries and make their way. It's also deeply problematic, especially in democratic societies. So the old line, this is from a much earlier form of migration, but intra-European migration, when lots of guest workers were coming to Switzerland, and the author Max Frisch said, we wanted workers, but people came. If you're going to take a lot of people into your country, how do you do, there is going to be a problem. If they're people, shouldn't they be part of the political system? But if they are, isn't that going to be really problematic for the workers who are already there? And if you bring labor and isn't given political representation, then you're generating, even if it's for good motives, you're generating a kind of apartheid. And there's got to be, with sufficiently large migration, there's got to be a problem of exacerbating income inequality. For what it's worth, there's a fair bit of argument that the immigration we've actually seen in the United States in recent decades probably isn't doing very much of that. Turns out that the immigrant workers are not competing very much with native-born workers, probably, but certainly the issue is there. So my view on migration in general is if you're not conflicted about this, there's something wrong with you. It's very hard morally, and I mean economically it's great for world GDP, but politically, morally, it's tough.
Let me ask you both then to comment on something. Branko, you raised a very interesting question. I know it really was someone else's question in your book, and that was essentially, what is the analogy, or is there an analogy, between migration and the trading of goods? And as it's often said, it's a common economic argument that fewer barriers to trade are good, but we need to think about compensating the losers. As Paul's noted, nobody would deny that there are losers typically. The question is, can we tell the same story, which would be to argue for open barriers, movement of migrants freely across the globe, but then to think about ways to compensate the so-called losers? Does that analogy hold?
Well, this was the analogy, actually, I think, proposed by Lant Pritchett, actually. That was exactly as you said, is that we believe that trade is good, but there are, of course, losers from trade, and we try to actually have trade and compensate those who are losing. Likewise, for global reduction of poverty or global inequality, even if we don't care about inequality globally, we do in principle care about poverty, and of course migration would be a great force for the good. So Lant was saying, so we should then apply to migration the same rules that we apply to trade, so be in favor of migration, and if there are losers, then we should compensate the losers. Now, it is clear that technically, whether you really become rich in your own country because your own country grows fast, or you become rich because you move to a different country that is richer. From the point of view of the world, it's really equivalent because we really look in this graph and the other graphs at global numbers. So for us, really, whether the person is in China or the US or Bolivia is equivalent. The problem, of course, is, quote unquote, the problem is the world is not organized as a single unit, as a single world. It is organized in political units, which are states or countries, rather. And then, as Paul quoted Max Frisch, you basically have people who, you want workers, but people come, and politically, that is very difficult to accommodate. So that's where the problem comes, and I think basically you end up, I believe, with a sort of a trade-off. Do you really want to have this big instrument, big tool for the reduction of global poverty and inequality work, and then you have to adjust somehow to make native population, domestic population willing to accept them? Or do you say, well, we will just shut off this big tool of global income reduction and just forget it and keep local population as they are? So I think that's the big sort of dilemma that we have.
And just to say, even on trade, while it's true that the textbook theoretical case for trade, you accept that it's going to have large effects on income distribution, but that's okay because the winners can compensate the losers, except that never actually happens. And so, and even less so when it comes to immigration.
Right, okay. So before we move on to within-country inequality, let me pose one other question, Paul. I'd like you to comment on this first, if you would. Economic growth, what's the relation? We've talked about economic growth in poorer countries as one of the strategies for reducing global inequality. What's the relationship between within-country inequality and economic growth? This is a big discussion in the rich countries and the poor countries. I know you've spoken about this a lot. It's often said that inequality is a drag on growth. It's an argument that a lot of people have picked up on because it has a lot of political currency. I know Joe Stiglitz is a big proponent of this claim. Paul, you've disagreed with him somewhat. How would you tell the story? Is there a trade-off between inequality and growth?
So let's start with the traditional story, which is that anything you do to limit within-country inequality is going to hurt economic growth, and so there is a trade-off. It's the leaky bucket. You try and take money from the well-off and give it to the less well-off, and that's going to help, but it's going to reduce incentives. It's going to hurt economic growth. There is that surely is true if you at a very extreme level, 100% marginal tax rates. Even I will agree that those will have some incentive effect. However, in the evidence that we can see, there is no evidence at all. There's no sign that redistributionist policies within the range that we actually see in the world, including the whole range of the modern advanced world, that they actually do any damage to economic growth. So there is really no evidence of a trade-off. Possibly, we can think that maybe incentive effects are overrated, that other effects, resource effects, that having people able to educate their children and provide adequate nutrition offset that. Now, where we go, and where not exactly a dispute, but sort of difference in degrees of caution between myself and Joe Stiglitz is, to what extent do we think that reducing inequality is actually pro-growth? And there are various arguments you can make for why that might be true, which are very difficult to validate in any direct sense, and some of them are problematic. And then there are cross-country comparisons. And the trouble with all of these things, is that when you go cross-country comparisons, there's lots of stuff going on. And it might be true that reducing inequality actually increases growth. It might not be true. There's certainly no evidence that it hurts growth, but my line has been with, in arguing this with Joe, but he's got some pretty good arguments, but mine is basically don't be greedy. We've shown that you can actually reduce inequality, that you can do a lot to reduce inequality without any discernible negative effect on growth. You don't want to nail yourself to claims that it's actually pro-growth when we're really not sure about that. But it's well within the range of uncertainty. The important thing is that the trade-off, the adverse trade-off between equalization and growth is just nowhere to be found in the evidence. It's purely an act of faith when people claim that raising the tax rate on top incomes or expanding the earned income tax credit or something is going to hurt growth. There's no evidence at all for that.
Maybe just very briefly, if I may, just something from my book is essentially one very important episode that I'm not going to talk about theoretical relationship, and of course the empirical evidence is all over the place, and I think actually we would have better evidence now with much better data that we have. Like, you know, in the publications 10 or 15 years ago, we had basically, we compare cross-sectionally, cross-country, and we basically have only two variables, the GDP per capita and its growth rate, and the Gini coefficient and the change. So it's really very rough. But now we have much more in terms of data. But historically, one thing that I actually point out in my book, if anybody cares to look at it later, is that this is something that we know, but we forget that for the rich countries, for the advanced countries, the period after World War II was characterized, and actually all the way to 1980s, by dramatic reductions of inequality and very high growth rates and a large increase in GDP per capita. And of course, for some countries, now we get into what I call the Kuznets cycles, but for some countries like Italy, for example, you have 1/3 of inequality being reduced, and you have GDP per capita increasing by factor of 4 or 5. So, and of course the US as well. Actually, if you look at each decade, on average, US reduced its inequality by 3 Gini points, which is a lot, and then the growth rate was on average about 30% per each 10 years. So basically, we had a period where empirically that trade-off did not exist in the long run.
Right, which cast doubt on that. I'm going to shift gears now to chapter 3 of this discussion. As Branko has argued, of course, the story of global inequality has many components. One of them are big differences in mean income across countries, and another one, of course, is the question of what's happening to inequality within countries, which takes us back to somewhat more familiar territory. I'm just going to walk you through 3 pictures rather quickly. These are from the data from the Luxembourg Income Study. So this is a very simple snapshot of a single point in time of income inequality across 23 affluent countries. So let me just explain quickly. Some of you may have seen this. It's kind of a classic by now. Again, it's a simple snapshot. It presents household income, inequality in household income. That household income is adjusted for household size, which is fairly standard. And this uses the Gini, which is a measure that most of you know, I think, fairly well, which is scaled sometimes 0 to 100, sometimes 0 to 1. A larger number, of course, is more inequality. This particular income definition is what we call disposable income. So it's income from the labor market, from capital, and from transfers, public and private, so all the pensions and things like this, although this is the non-elderly population. And then subtracting direct taxes that are paid out by the household. Okay, so it's disposable household income, so it takes no account, though, of the value of public services, and it takes no account of wealth, nor does it take account of expenditures other than taxes, but it's a very standard measure. So what do we see here? We see that among these 23 rich countries, the U.S. is in its in the position there of having the highest level of inequality. The Gini is 37 in the U.S. This is from 2010, give or take a year in 1 or 2 countries. So just to take a quick note, one thing you can see here, there's a certain amount of country clustering. Inequality tends to be higher in the English-speaking countries. And also, so that would be U.S., U.K., Canada, Australia. Also in the southern European countries, Italy, Spain, and Greece, it tends to be lowest in the usual suspects, the Nordic countries, Denmark, Finland, Iceland, and so on. The continental Eastern European countries are spread out somewhere in between. What you do see here is this is a lot of difference. In other words, the difference between 0.24, which we see in Denmark, and 0.37 in the United States is very large. Typically, a 1-point difference in samples this big is statistically significant. A 3-point difference is substantive. So what does this tell us? I think, among other things, it tells us that national institutions matter. We're going to come back to that, and they matter quite a lot. So income inequality in the U.S. is high. This is just, of course, in 2010, sort of in the middle of the transition from recession to recovery. What has happened in the United States in the last 30 years, also a story that's fairly well known. It's been a story of rising, and quite sharply rising inequality. It's risen from 0.31 in 1979 up to, as you saw, about 0.37. This takes us up to 2013. This is a very typical story, a recession. There's a dip in inequality, mostly at the top. Capital income falls during the recovery. Oftentimes inequality rises, which is what we saw here. The bottom is sticky, but the top recovered. So the US is definitely a story of really rather sharply rising inequality. Where has the rise been? It's been above the median. So what we've seen is a sharp rise, especially in the ratio of about the 90th percentile to the median, and a very sharp rise in the top 1%. That's the story. You can't really get that from survey data, but that's what we know, of course, from the work from Thomas Piketty and others. So the US is, across the rich countries, it stands out as both high inequality and also the most sharply rising during this 3-decade period. So let me show you one more slide, which is a sort of diagnostic slide. This is from some work that Branko and I did together. And this is going to help you understand why, when we come back to this picture, why the US is here with so much inequality. There's really two parts to this story. What you have here on the horizontal axis is, these are the same 23 countries. On the horizontal axis, you have inequality in market income. So that's before the taxes and transfers. That's inequality in income, mostly from the labor market, from wages and self-employment, and also from capital. On the vertical axis, you have the difference between the post-tax and transfer, the disposable income, and the pre-tax and transfer. So in an accounting sense, it's a measure of redistribution. It's a rather crude measure, but it's a simple difference there. So what do you see? There's the US with its little red dot. You can see now what's driving the high inequality in the prior slide is that the market income inequality is really quite high in cross-national terms, and the level of redistribution is mediocre. Right, so those two stories together add up to essentially this here. So let me just walk you through a couple of pairs just to put a little bit of life to this story. So take a look at Ireland. I'm not sure if we have there we go. So there's Ireland compared to the US. If you look at this pair of countries, so Ireland on market inequality here on the horizontal axis, Ireland in 2010, very high market income inequality, 0.53 on the Gini scale, and the US was 0.48. But the redistribution by this measure, Ireland 23 Gini points removed by taxes and transfers. In contrast, the US 10 Gini points. So the end result, when we come back to this slide, is that income inequality at the end of the day is substantially lower in Ireland than it is in the US because, so it's 0.30 versus 0.37. They've basically redistributed. They've removed quite a lot of that income inequality. Just as similar, to put a little more life to this, again, as the case of Denmark and Italy. For those of you who study wealthy countries, this won't surprise you. Market income inequality actually quite high in the Nordic countries. That surprises people. A little higher in Denmark, 0.38, than in Italy, 0.36, but a similar contrast, redistribution, 14 points of inequality removed by taxes and transfers in Denmark, 3 points in Italy, and then that's the end result, is the Danish case, the least income inequality after taxes and transfers. So it's a combination. That's what's going on here that's driving the story in the US. So somewhat in simple terms then, how can we think about interventions? We're going to assume for a moment that we think this would be a good idea to reduce this disposable income inequality in the United States. We can think then, of course, of strengthening institutions that would narrow the dispersion of market income, that would have the US move to the left, or we could think of institutions that would strengthen redistribution, which would be, of course, to have it move up. So let me turn that over to my colleagues. What should we do? What do we do now, Paul? How do we make America great again?
Yeah, and you know, the best answer we have is that you do lots of stuff, right? So I don't know who's responsible for pre-distribution and redistribution, but
Jacob Hacker.
Okay, well, okay, I've reduced my assessment. No, actually, it's good. So things. Can you change the distribution of market income? There's is it just supply and demand, and the invisible hand will punish you if you intervene? And the answer there is a really clear no. There's now lots and lots of work. We know that at least moderate increases in the minimum wage have no discernible effect on employment. The U.S. stands out as having a very low minimum wage by international standards, very low relative to its own historical standards, relative to average wages. So you can raise minimum wages. Labor. The fact that the United States has such a weak labor movement is not you tend to think, if you only know the United States, you say, well, it had to happen because of globalization, and you just can't be unionized, except that nobody else has as weak a labor movement as we do. Denmark faces the same global economy we do, but 2/3 of its workforce is unionized. Even Canada has unionization rates that are well over twice ours. So, and it was the legal and political environment that led to the collapse of the U.S. labor movement. So politics, your pot, the pot. I guess we start out in Colorado anyway, and then so you can work on that, and then redistribution. Again, everything we know says that there's a lot you can do with tax and transfer. It's all really I think, do we know? Do we know? Can I list you things and prove quantitatively that I could turn the U.S. into Denmark by doing them? The answer is no. But there's every reason to think we could do quite a lot if we had the political system that would permit it.
Let me add a little bit of detail to that. I know I'm worrying that we're becoming an echo chamber here because I was going to sort of put the same list of items out. But just a couple of things to say, though. The minimum wage. So I think, indeed, we could do a lot to shift the market distribution. This term that Paul raised, pre-distribution, our colleague Leslie McCall, who's not here tonight, thinks it should actually be called pre-redistribution, which makes a little bit more sense. The term pre-distribution is out there now, referring to essentially policy mechanisms that would shift the market distribution, in other words, earlier in the chain than taxes and transfers. A recent book by Tony Atkinson that a lot of us have read and I think admire, Inequality, What Can Be Done, he's really stressed this, that we've been talking much too much about taxes and transfers and we should be thinking much more about the market distribution. Two really important stories about the US. I would just echo what Paul said. One is the minimum wage. I'm holding a picture in my hand from the OECD, something I just took a look at today. Of 36 of the richest countries in the world, we have the third lowest minimum wage. If you look at the minimum wage relative to the median, we're down there with Mexico and the Czech Republic. So we're way, way below. The minimum wage has eroded over time. It's famously known that the US has a large low-wage labor market. About 25% of American workers earn low wages. OECD defines that as less than 2/3 of the median. There's a very strong correlation between this minimum wage and this share of low-wage workers. And another picture that I grabbed today, I was looking at some OECD studies on this. Indeed, very low rates of unionization, union coverage in the US, of course, it declined, very low. And a study done by the OECD showed just a simple correlation. The correlation between the share of the labor force that's covered by collective agreements and the share that earn low pay, it's 0.83, negative 0.83. They're very strong relationships. So unions and minimum wages matter. And then just to pick up on two other instruments that I think you mentioned, I was doing my homework today, which I love to do, just looking at the latest numbers. None of this has changed over time, but just taking a look again, looking at spending on non-elderly households. Now they're just standard OECD data. The US is third from the bottom. We're looking at spending at every different measure of spending on households, especially, again, non-elderly households. The OECD average about 2.55% of GDP, essentially in cash transfers to families in the US. Third from the bottom, only lower is Korea and Mexico. We're spending about 1% of GDP. And on I go. I was looking at taxes as well. Of course, despite, I know, Paul, you blogged about this last week, despite one of our Republican candidates claiming we have the highest taxes in the world, we actually have nearly the lowest taxes among the industrialized countries. So the point is, as I think I would agree with Paul, that we could do lots of stuff. Atkinson lays out 15 different policy levers. They're not all equally politically feasible. I think we'll end on a little bit of politics. But we know how we could reduce income inequality. We don't know that we can make the US Denmark, but we certainly know how we could move this graph around. It's really not a question of intellectual technology, it's a question of political will.
Yeah, the way I like to think about it, let me just give you one story. First of all, on market incomes, we used to have well-paid union workers in the manufacturing sector. Turns out that unionization really fell off a cliff in the 1980s. And it's true that the manufacturing sector was under a lot of pressure, and General Motors was declining and was no longer the largest employer in America. What was emerging at that point as the largest employer in America was Walmart. Why couldn't big box stores have been unionized? They don't face global competition, right? And so the question was, why wasn't there actually an effective organizing effort? Well, who was president in the 1980s? What was the political environment? It really was a political choice not to have that kind of market power on the part of workers. That's why we have such low unionization. Imagine if we in fact had 1 million organized Walmart workers, that would have been a substantial slug of middle-class incomes that are in fact missing from the U.S. Income distribution. And that's not the only story, but I think that's the way you want to think about the market side. And then, yeah, spending. We are way at the bottom in terms of support for families, support. These are all choices. I guess the good news is you can. It's as you say, in a way, we know how to do this. We just don't know how to persuade a sufficient number of voters to support it.
Branko, you want to add to this?
Well, it seems we should have actually called this part like "Let's make America Denmark again." It looks like that. So under that heading, as John had said, actually, that red dot the improvements come either because you would move that red dot left, or you would have to move this red dot up. If you move it left, you reduce market income inequality. If you move it up, you redistribute more. Now, I'm becoming skeptical that definitely there are measures like the minimum wage, trade unions, others that actually can move this red dot. They would actually move red dot left, and then there is redistribution that would actually move it up. But I'm skeptical about moving it up very much in the US, and I think that one of the indirect messages, actually, of Piketty's book and the focus on capital was that actually we should look much more on the inequality in endowments. Now, this is kind of economies for essentially people having very concentrated capital assets, or actually people having human capital which is also unequal. But let me just say one thing about capital assets. Actually, I've not paid much attention to that before, but when you look at all the rich countries, and America is actually sort of an extreme of that case, you have extremely high concentration of income from assets, from ownership, from capital. When we talk about the Gini coefficients, these Gini coefficients are 85, 90. This is a number that we never kind of see in any other sort of conditions, except when you look at the distribution of assets, income from capital. And then moreover, the problem is that share of capital income in total net product or GDP is increasing. So the problem is twofold. First, you have that capital share going up, and if it was not concentrated, if, for example, everybody had the same share of capital, then it would not be a problem. But it's extremely concentrated, so that actually really makes the problem much worse. And I think one should really work there on that point.
Actually, I just want to say one thing that I fall into also is we tend to approach these things if obviously everyone on this stage wants to see inequality reduced, and it can easily turn into a sort of sense of despair. And it's probably worth pointing out, if we actually look at the agenda of the current, the administration finishing up its last year right now, the average effective federal tax rate on the top 1% has gone up to just about what it was in 1979. We've essentially at the top seen taxation fully retrace the steps that it took during the Reagan years. And we've just seen the enactment of a really major transfer program that mostly benefits people at lower incomes, otherwise known as Obamacare. So it's not as if you can never do things. Even in the United States, even with this deeply partisan gridlock, you can actually make quite a lot of difference. And I think the effect on welfare, the effect on the safety net that ordinary people experience has been huge. So don't want to look at this and say, oh God, we can't become Denmark, therefore nothing can be done. We can, if we move even just a little ways in that direction, it can have huge human impacts.
I remember, Paul, when we were discussing Atkinson's book, he begins the book by, Tony Atkinson, a great inequality scholar, begins the book by noting that there's no single level of inequality that we would sort of consider to be ideal. That's a difficult question to answer. And I remember I asked you, Paul, what would be what's the right level of inequality, or what country would you think did it best? And you said the United States in the 1950s. So I think the point being that there's nothing absolutely in the DNA of the United States going back centuries. People tell this story that there's something about the really fundamental structure in the US that's driven inequality to the level that it is now. But it's actually a fairly recent story. It's a political story and it's a fairly recent one.
Yeah, and things change. I mean, to think that the political environment that led to the United States busting out in the direction of greater inequality is our future forever. Well, I think we've just seen that we're not sure what the hell is happening to our political landscape, but it's certainly changing. And
What I actually agree with Janet, and I think many people who believe that nothing can be done, of course, always have a recourse to this American exceptionalism. So U.S. is very unequal because it has always been unequal. People value opportunity. There are immigrants who come and so on. And I think that story does, of course, have some semblance of plausibility. But if you look at the data, for example, historically, and now we have the data from the new book by Peter Lindert and Jeff Williamson about U.S. inequality from 1774 until today. In the beginning, when you look, US, of course, was much more equal than UK. They actually use this comparison between UK, actually, or England and the US. And then, of course, US inequality, and particularly at the very top, of course, UK top 1% to the extent we can judge, was much, much richer than here. And then, of course, after that, there was a sort of a catch-up, but UK inequality was still much higher. And then afterwards, of course, we have this period of great leveling in both UK and the US that, of course, went from, in the case of the US, from the Great Depression, either 29 or 33, all the way to 1980. So it's not actually true that US was always sort of remarkably unequal and there were no periods where actually, first, it was more equal than European countries, and secondly, it experienced long periods of decline in inequality.
It just occurred to me that one of the things, by finishing with this discussion of U.S. inequality, we're also kind of, we can lose sight, if we go back to Branko's original, the famous picture, which some people for some reason think looks like an elephant, and Janet and I think looks like a camel. But anyway, this is not a story of everything going badly in the world. It's not a story of plutocrats running away with everything. Plutocrats have run away with a lot of stuff. In the advanced countries, but we actually think that quite a lot could be done about that. And meanwhile, this is a story of enormous progress for a lot of people. We're talking about billions of people here. So this has not been a bad 25 years. It's been a complex 25 years, but not all bad by any means.
Let me end also on, I'm going to make just one more, I suppose, optimistic observation, then turn it open to the audience for questions. I think it almost goes without saying by now that there's been this incredible explosion of interest in inequality. Starting somewhere around 5 or 6 years ago, we've been reflecting on it. There are many markers of it. For us at LIS, I have to say, I realize this is a very sort of an insular observation, but our phone used to ring 3-4 times a year with media queries. And starting after Occupy Wall Street, Piketty book came out, lots of other things. It was more like 20 times a week. The explosion of interest in inequality, we have felt it so strongly. We've been working on this for 30 years. For 25 of them, no one cared. And I do think, though, that we've all been reflecting on this, and Branko writes about it, and so does Atkinson. I think, Paul, you've spoken about it. This newfound interest in inequality is sticky. 3 or 4 years ago, we were sitting around saying, this is going to have to burst. This bubble is not going to last. But it is lasting, and it's becoming institutionalized. Lots of new data are being created. New resources are being put into the types of ingredients that we need to do the kind of work that Branko does and we do. Lots of new academic programs, lots of new books. But also, the fundamentals of economics are shifting. I think we're trying to play a role in that. Less than these economists here. But the economics field itself is shifting to begin to understand heterogeneity and other kinds of things. So I think this is new, and at least, of course, this is from within the perspective of research and academia and the policy world as well. Something has happened, and I think we all think that to some extent it's irreversible. I would hope so. On that note, we're going to take questions from the audience. Let me ask you to go to the mics. We have about 15 minutes, and the normal rules apply. Say who you are, please. Please don't give a speech. And if you do, I will cut you off. And direct your question to someone in particular, if you'd like.
Okay. As far as I can see, there seems to be a lack of diversity in discussion of inequality in media. Media talks only about bad inequality, but there might be some good inequality as well. Let's say it looks like even if a person, thanks to its talent and hard work, achieves more than somebody who is good for nothing, it's also sometimes considered bad inequality. So I wonder if there are any works that focus on good inequality, define it and draw a line and defend it. If it's a clear question, I'm done.
Let me suggest that we collect a few questions. Shall we collect 3 and then answer? The audio is not great, but I think you said we should, are there good forms of inequality? That's your
Yes,
question, basically?
yes.
So there's a little bit. Let's take 3 questions and then answer, and then there's so many of you. Go ahead.
About the minimum wage, can you hear me? About the minimum wage, my extremely conservative friends, who I have a shockingly large number of, argue that it's basic economics that if you raise the minimum wage, inflation will rise, and the value of that increase will be almost wiped out. The second argument they make is if you raise the minimum wage, McDonald's will put in automated kiosks to take your money and place your orders, and your jobs will disappear. How do you respond to that?
Let's take one more, and then we'll answer them.
Hi, Lev Menovich from the Graduate Center. Thank you for a most amazing tour de force and for debunking so many myths in 1 hour. So my question is, you told us great stories, but we also know this idea of a country, it's a bit of a myth, right? Because, for example, in Korea, 50% of people live in Seoul. So my question, if we start kind of breaking these pictures, by, for example, cities versus suburbs, right? Or mega cities, or genders, or ethnicities, are there going to be particular variables which will give us completely different pictures? Or are we going to get versions of this picture?
Are there good forms of inequality?
Okay, we have to be brief because, of course, there are lots of people, so I will try to be. One important thing is to realize, and maybe sometimes people do not realize it immediately. When we talk about inequality, it's not a dichotomy between equality and inequality. It's not like you're either equal and everybody has the same income, or you're unequal. So it's actually, we are talking about the range. So when we speak about inequality and that the inequality is too high, we don't mean that the alternative is that actually everybody should have the same income. So let me make this clear. The alternative is to have less inequality. It doesn't mean that everybody has the same income. And on bad and good inequality, I think they're actually most promising. There are several promising venues, but I think one particular, which is, I think, very promising, is the work which follows actually John Romer's idea, is that essentially we can now, with disaggregated data, we can tell how much of that inequality that we observe, like, for example, between us here, was due to the circumstances, like suppose gender, education of your parents, race, and so on, which you can call bad inequality because it's not something that is actually you deserved that income, or you don't deserve to have a low income on account of negatives. And there is a second part which may be due to effort or luck, that is actually you can call good inequality. So basically I want to say that we actually are moving, and we have empirical work including actually distinguishing between good and bad inequality in the US over time, and showing that good inequality is related to higher growth rates and bad inequality is actually bad for growth.
Paul, can you help this fellow
Yeah,
with his
so minimum
conservative
wage.
friends?
This is actually, this is a case of economists doing what they really should and learning. The reason that we think that minimum wage increases over some range are a good thing comes from a remarkable 20 years now of empirical work, starting with Card and Kruger, where it turns out we have lots of natural experiments in minimum wages because they're set at the state level. And so when one state raises the minimum wage and neighboring states do not, you get an observation on what happens. You can compare counties just across a line, and the overwhelming evidence from that is that you don't see the job losses that these stories would say you should see. So then the question becomes, how can that be? And the answer, I think, basically is that people are not bushels of wheat. That the labor market is not just a market like the market for some commodity, that people have incentives, that there are some that employers are not atomistic. There really isn't a single hiring hole where everybody meets. There's some search involved. And for a variety of reasons, there are a higher wage may induce workers to work harder or be or have lower turnover, which makes them more efficient, which makes the wage affordable. It may be that in some cases large employers in the very local labor market are actually monopsonists. They're holding wages down in an attempt to keep their labor costs low, and if you raise the minimum wage, they have no incentive to do that anymore, so they may hire. There are a variety of explanations, but it appears that the labor market is sufficiently different from the market for wheat or the market for I don't know, cement or something. Actually, probably not a good example, but the point is that we now have hundreds and hundreds of these natural experiments. There's just lots of opportunities to see this, and they all want to say that the effect on employment is zero. So this is evidence. We're looking at evidence, which has a well-known liberal bias. Anyway.
The other thing to remember, of course, is that the minimum wage has eroded. So much of the discussion about raising the minimum wage is restoring it to levels that we saw for long periods of time in the past.
And just to say, I think everyone agrees that if you had a $35 minimum wage, we would have problems, right? So, but the question is whether bringing it up to a historical norm relative to average wages is likely to cause job losses. And the answer is, the evidence pretty strongly says no.
And the discussion in New York, of course, has been around, for the most part, around this $15 an hour wage. And I think most people think the discussion in New York, I know there's been a certain amount of differentiation across the state, but that the state can sustain the proposals in New York, especially New York City. Your question was about other kinds of disparities. I'm afraid I had a little trouble hearing it.
Right.
So I think this reminds me of a question actually that I was going to ask you, Branko, if I understand. Let me segue just slightly that we just didn't ask in the interest of time. One of the interesting things you discuss and that other people do is that while income distributions are widening, many forms of intergroup disparities are narrowing. Gender disparities are narrowing. You know, there's all kinds of new, you know, what we were celebrating. Racial gaps are narrowing in many ways. You know, sexual orientation, gender, urban, rural, I'm not so sure. But so there's sort of a paradox that certain forms of inequality are reducing while income distributions within all of these groups are exploding. What do we know about that?
Okay, again, quite briefly, first to answer the question, actually, you cannot, because of really data requirements, you know, technically, if you really tried very hard, it could be possible to generate this graph for rural and urban areas in the world. It's not going to be easy, but I think it's technically possible. But then going further, like for example, I'm often asked that question, and of course that's what you're also alluding to. Can we do the same graph for like a gender? Like, do we need, how have women done compared to men, for example, globally? That's very difficult or actually impossible with the data that we have because we really focus on household, and then all the income in household is by assumption in our data distributed equally between everybody who is member of the household. So we can do wage stuff on earnings when we know who is earning what, but here it's actually more difficult.
Just to say that, Branko, when you do this, this is not an arbitrary, this is not based on countries. I mean, the data comes from countries, but in fact, the axis here is people.
Right. No, the axis is people. The problem would be, for example, for rural, you would have to have all the data that I had, and each country, you would have to have rural-urban identifiers.
But
so some countries may not have it. So
but this is a sort of natural. It's a rootless cosmopolitan view of the world.
It's rootless cosmopolitan view, exactly. And we could have rootless cosmopolitan view also for rural areas and urban areas. But as I said, it's data intensive. Now, on the you know, issues of what is called horizontal inequality, I'm very briefly, very unpopular view because I've got like 2 or 3 unpopular views in this book. One of them is that I think we rightly have focused a lot on reducing or eliminating differences that are due to, you know, gender, race, other things. But I think this is not the end of the story because you can actually have the mean wage of women and men being the same, but the underlying distributions being very, very unequal. So in other words, it is really, we should not lose sight of the very fact that even sort of total equality of the mean wages between the two genders might actually still allow you to have huge inequality within women earnings and also huge inequality among men earnings. So that was my point.
And that's in fact what's happening in the United States, is inequality within the two genders has risen quite a bit, and within many occupations as well. I think we have time for two more. I'm getting a signal to move us along. Yep.
If you were to be looking at the future, how do you foresee climate change affecting global income inequality?
Let's hold that question and take one more, and then I'm afraid we'll have to close.
I'll make this very brief. I remember 1950. It isn't worse now, it's better. I made 35 cents an hour. Adjusted for inflation, that's $14 an hour. And I thought I was being overpaid. Probably was. Only Professor Krugman mentioned the question of future population, and I think you ought to address in these numbers the likelihood of a doubling in population over the next 20 years. Whether it comes from outside or inside is not really relevant.
Okay. Climate change.
Climate change. Climate change could make global distribution more equal by wiping out the people on the left. I mean, actually, the thing about climate change, even though the bulk of the emissions have come from countries that are wealthy, of course the people who are most vulnerable are the poor in the poor countries, and that's I'm not sure that thinking about what this does to the global Gini coefficient is the right way to think about it, but you want to think, I mean, it actually comes back, if you want to think about places that are really at risk, again, Bangladesh, someplace like that is going to be terribly vulnerable, both because of geography, but also because they don't have a lot of resources. I'm not quite sure I understood the second question.
Let me mention just 2 points about climate change, if I could. A little bit of advertisement of one of our other events. We had an event on stage here on Earth Day last year with Joe Stiglitz and Nicholas Stern discussing the question of the relationship between inequality and climate change, which is a hugely important, I think, an interesting question. And I would say two conclusions came out of that. They're both perhaps somewhat obvious. One is that the impact of climate change is going to be felt very unequally across countries and within countries, in fact. So it's those who, of course, have the poorest are the ones who are going to have the least opportunity for climate change mitigation and protection and so forth. But the other argument that came out, which I think is a very interesting one, and Branko addresses this somewhat as well, this is really more of an open question, but what's the impact of inequality on protections from climate change, from the damage of climate change? So for example, one of the things that we're concerned about is places that are very unequal. The well-to-do are sort of opting out of the public grid. They've got, private electrical systems and private walls and so forth, and seem to be investing less in the kinds of infrastructures and seawalls and so forth. And so there's a nice piece of research that was just done on this. Branko is going to do this himself across states and jurisdictions. So inequality and climate change are related with causal relationships in both directions, actually, and I think it's something we need to be thinking about a great deal.
Can I say
Last
about
word?
demographics?
Absolutely, yes.
Because you guys have answered beautifully the climate change. On which I have no idea how it would affect this graph. But on demographics, I do. And one thing that we didn't mention here, because we didn't have time, is this kind of missing continent. Often it's Africa. And Africa is going to play a very important role in that graph in the next 20 years or so, because it's a continent, as we know, with actually rising population. And, of course, poor, and also with very volatile growth rates. So we have had a relatively good period from 2000 to 2010, or maybe 2012 or whatever, where Africa most countries were growing at 4 or 5%. That was good. But we don't know what will happen in Africa, and as Asia ages, and of course we know with China to have reached the peak in terms of reaching the peak of the population, that graph can actually, optimistically, we can actually see the catch-up of Asia, and this graph really looking good in the future. But on the other hand, if there is no convergence of African countries, meaning that they're actually catching up with the rest of the world, this graph can actually can also turn out to look in the next 20 years pretty bad. So demographics do really play a role. We can actually play a little bit with the numbers, but obviously we don't know what will be the growth rates, and we don't know what will happen to inequalities within nations. But we have to keep that in mind. That's actually a big sort of unknown here.
It's my sad duty to bring this to a close. So thank you to my colleagues and to the audience.